Well, thank you very much, and thank you for the kind introduction. One of the things that I wanted to do is actually reflect upon this call to arms for a smart Arctic, and really to start with the almost obvious point that very few people would object to being described as smart. There are very few of us, alternatively speaking, who wish to be thought of as dumb. But what's really, I think, important is to think about what smartness or being smarter might actually involve. And I think when we think about the rise of smartness, we're often referring to, I think, to the last 10 or 20 years, where it's been really popularized with reference to the onset of the knowledge economy, the idea that the big data, that the digital, the artificial intelligence, that automation will deliver what I would describe as a kind of promise economy, that if only we can use these things really well, then there's a bright future ahead of us. I think I'd like to caution you a little bit about some of that, however, and to use the state of Alaska as an example, as a warning, and to ask you to cast your minds back to about 50 or 60 years when there was a different kind of smart Arctic in play, and that was one where it was thought that nuclear engineering would be a really smart way of giving what Senator Murkowski has talked about, port infrastructure. Nowadays, of course, we would probably react with horror at the idea that nuclear weapons might be used to artificially re-engineer Arctic ecologies. So, in a sense, every generation has thought that it possessed smartness. And I think we need to ask what is distinctively smart about ours. One change that I think is very welcome from, say, 60 years ago, is we're now far more likely to see sea ice as critical infrastructure, not only to Arctic communities, but also Arctic ecologies, whereas 60 years ago, we would have seen sea ice as an obstacle, something that could have literally been bombed away by nuclear weapons. Secondly, when we think of resilience and being resilient, we do have to also manage a tension between, on the one hand, often individuals being asked to be resilient, to be more flexible, to be more durable, to be more capable in terms of coping with change. But let's also think about how that balances out with being collectively resilient. What does it mean to talk about resilience in an Arctic context, one in which it's still struggling with processing legacies of settler colonialism, legacies of gendered inequalities, continued legacies of infrastructural inequalities. So in a sense, all of these conversations become more complicated once we also acknowledge the complexity of the Arctic, past, present, and let alone future. Thirdly, if we're interested in the smart Arctic, I suspect it's because at this particular moment, we realize we're in an anthropocentric moment. We realize that nature can no longer be thought of as a black box, can be thought of as a kind of passive backdrop to human affairs. It's perhaps in the Arctic more than ever that we learn that actually nature is inherently and relentlessly dynamic and contingent. And I suspect our thinking and practice has not quite caught up. The final thing I want to say in terms of summing up, I think, is that a smart Arctic is going to be both inventive and preventive. And I think what we have to try and get away from is this constant call to what we might think of as kind of firefighter solutions, where we're actually dealing with things as and when they occur, as opposed to thinking slightly more long term. And in that sense, we probably do need to get more theatrical. We need to get more inventive. We need to be able to think not only, as I say, of different kinds of language, but very, very different kinds of practice. And whatever that practice and that thinking may involve, it has got to be, I think, attentive to those very complex realities that, in a sense, inhabit everyday Arctic. So to call for a smart Arctic is to recognize that no one has a monopoly on smartness, but also that we can't talk about the Arctic singular. We have to acknowledge and recognize we are always talking about multiple Arctics, geographically varied, but also very varied and intersectional, inevitably. Thank you very much.
you.